This is Jack and Sean coming from the AQ Lounge. Huge upgrade from my mother's basement. Welcome back to another episode of the DWC Done with Civ podcast, where we'll be speaking about issues centered around all things South Africa. For our new listeners, I'm your host, Jack Langrock, a history enthusiast under the tutelage of Dr. Edward Andrews of Providence College. Sean, want to introduce yourself for the folks back home?
What's going on, our Done with Civers? Great to be back. This is your king, Sean King, sociology and economics guru here.
So Sean, what do we have planned for today's podcast?
Well, Jack, here we have Dr. Grace Fitzgerald, professor of music at the University of Veritas Flame. Also, we have English professor Dr. Liz Lococo from Phillips Memorial Library. So welcome, guys. Happy to have you both on the show. They are here to talk to us about the music and literature in South Africa, with commentary from Jack and I on the history and economics that correlate to their research.
So great to be here. Can't wait to jump in.
Wow, I feel so welcomed. Happy to be here.
Let's get started.
Africa is changing.
Nothing in this reform concentrates power in the hands of the President of the Republic. Nothing. And no one can prove it.
And some of the boys, they find jobs, and some of the boys, they don't find jobs.
Police have used rubber bullets and water cannons to try and disperse protesters who are campaigning for a pay rise.
Community has become divided.
Well, on this, the second day of the strike, the protesters are becoming more agitated in their demands for an 8.6% pay increase.
But it is his desire to have absolute power. He wants to take everything.
South Africa hosted the Football World Cup last year.
To move with the changing world.
If you say South Africa, the world will say two things. Oh, Nelson Mandela, crime. Now they say Nelson Mandela, the World Cup.
Just to lay out what we are going to be talking about in today's episode, we have Liz and Grace here today to talk about their concentrated studies of literature and music to help give us insight to a well-rounded perspective of South Africa. But first, we're going to go to our enthusiast of history, Jack, to help set the scene for how we ended up here.
So now, it's time for everyone's favorite segment.
And only segment.
Jack's Time Machine! We're going to be setting the time machine back to 1650 this time. It is April 6, 1652, and Jan van Riebeeck arrives to South Africa with close to 200 white Dutchmen and women. South Africa had been a place that countries traded with in the past, but this arrival by Van Riebeeck was something that would mold the history of South Africa as we know it. The Dutch were going to settle there. This became a problem immediately for both sides, and violence was birthed from this Dutch takeover of South Africa. The Dutch eventually assumed control over the indigenous people and wiped out thousands through war and disease. The Dutch turned towards slavery and profited off the physically demanding labor that is required on farms. These tough living conditions made slaves turn towards religion. However, it wasn't what the Dutch were preaching and their Christian morals, it was Islam that they looked towards in their times of need.
That's very interesting, Jack. I found my research Christianity was a big reason for the development of African music. Specifically, when colonialization was occurring, the music of Africa was changing because these European scholars. There were three ways which Europeans went about doing this, and one of them was through Christianity, specifically through the work of missionaries, and the music began changing. The missionary discourse that occurred, translations of hymn books, liturgies, and the Bible into African language, introduced a different sound to the African people. This was a syncretic way Westerners were able to convert Africans by using their passion for music as a segue into Christianity. So I find it really interesting that before Christianity even took root in Africa, South Africans were more centered around the Islamic religion.
Yes, so South Africans converted to Christianity after the British came because they brought with them their faith and were more hardline to convert South Africans to Christianity. South Africans then took the religion and made it their own through their African churches, which also saw a major increase in the mid-1900s.
Grace, you mentioned there were three ways in which Europeans impacted the development of African music, Christianity being one of them. Could you elaborate on the other two ways, just out of curiosity?
Of course. So to point out, the Westerners believed the African music to be underdeveloped, in a sense, to their musical standards. It sounded completely different from what European music was, so they saw it as in desperate need of a fix. It was during the 1900s to the 1950s that European scholars began their pursuit of African musicology, starting studying and teaching music to Africans. A writer, Kofi Agawu, has mentioned this in his work. The other two ways the music in Africa began developing was through scholars wanting to learn about the African ways of tuning, rhythmic and metric organization, speech tone, and melody. This was a form of just archiving what they noticed and heard. The second way was through colonial domination. Teachers who had an interest in music were brought in to teach and share the European brilliance of music, educating Africans, bringing them away from their vile sounds.
You mentioned the colonial domination being a turning point for African music specifically. That colonial domination began when the British began their conquest in South Africa. They had their start after the Berlin Conference and were given slices of South Africa.
Well, Jack, since you're such a huge Berlin Conference guy, can you just explain to the people at home what happened there and why South Africa was such a hot commodity?
Thanks for asking that, Sean. The Berlin Conference is when European nations met to decide which countries were going to get each part of Africa. However, there were no African representatives present at the conference. South Africa became highly sought after at the Berlin Conference because of its newly found natural resource, gold.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's get back on track with the time machine segment.
Continuing, this led to not only the struggle of South Africans and white people, but now a new struggle of British and Afrikaners. This led to a series of wars, the Boer Wars, where the British fought against Africans and Boers. The British did not think of these people as humans and killed thousands through the use of concentration camps where the living conditions were poor and disease ran through them like wildfire. The British eventually win this war and begin a long string of events that lead to black men being stripped of the already little rights they had and were disenfranchised. For close to 60 years after the Boer Wars, there was little improvement to these conditions. Then in 1960, South Africa was made independent from the British Empire and they had to make their own new society. Due to the oppression that they faced prior to them becoming a separate country, whites took political control of the country once again and started a new policy, apartheid.
Well, since we all are under the tutelage of Ted Andrews, can you please elaborate a little more about the start of apartheid?
So South Africa was a country that seemed to be regressing in their race relations after gaining their independence. Racist lawmakers believed that blacks were not equal to white people and thought that blacks needed to be separated through apartheid. While a country like the United States is beginning to end their segregation ideals, they are just starting their own systematic racism all over again. Whites separated themselves from anyone that did not look like themselves, and a problem that stems from these segregation ideas is that white people are only 17% of the population at the time and have complete control over the government. This 17% minority of white people also has 87% of land in South Africa.
Wow, that is crazy. 87%. I did not know that.
Adding to that idea, South African writers have been known to put what little land they own up for collateral so they are able to publish their stories.
Sorry to interrupt, Jack, but Liz, can you explain a little more?
This is actually very interesting. Before apartheid, literacy rates were lower than during apartheid, yet significantly more works were produced in the earlier period. The decline of literary works is due to the censoring of South African texts by the government.
Wait, so because of the censorship by the government, many African authors could not publish their texts?
Yes, exactly.
That's something they leave out of history books. Back to the time machine. Apartheid was immediately a problem for the black people of the country, and rebellions ensued soon after. Living conditions got exponentially worse for South Africans, with a 10% increase of people living in homelands.
So what are homelands?
They are little shanty villages that were made in the impoverished parts of South Africa. We also see a major increase in the amount of activists arrested in the 1980s, which is shortly before the end of apartheid. When apartheid is finally abolished in South Africa, they hold a national election where Nelson Mandela is elected president and signifies the true ending of these apartheid laws. Since his election and the end of apartheid, it hasn't been quite how they thought it would be, with crime rates still high and poverty impacting many to this day.
Now they have the background information. Liz, maybe you can jump into what your focus of study is now?
Yes, of course. As in any society, literature is greatly shaped by history and politics. South African's literature originated from the tribal traditions of oral storytelling. Mbongi, or praise poets, were very important in tribal culture. Throughout colonialism, these praise poets were extremely influential in articulating ideology of South African society.
What were some of the ways that this oral tradition was used in South Africa?
Praise poets would tell stories of heroic battles, which represented their struggles with colonial invaders. With the change in rule, oral literature would go from being romantic stories involving animals such as insects and birds during times of peace to being stories about ferocious lions reflecting the colonial struggles. They were even used in politics, such as Alfred Kabula, who spoke to 60,000 people at a Mandela rally in Soweto, South Africa.
Wow, that is so interesting. Has there been a significant change in literacy rates since the Boer Wars?
Going back to the development of literature, we have to consider the education level and literacy rates. In the early 1900s, most South Africans were not literate, making oral tradition a prominent means of storytelling. The colonizers were more focused on the South Africans achieving physical goals, such as gold production, rather than the education of South Africans, as you mentioned earlier. As time progressed, an education system started to develop. This was an extremely poor system that used 40-year-old text, leaving many people underqualified. However, schooling also alienated children from using their native tongues, making them speak an English-Afrikaans blend.
That is true, but I think you need to look more into who is benefiting from education. We can see that the minority that is the wealthy are thriving. The majority are bearing the burden of a failed education system. Some reasons for this failure include high student-teacher ratios, poorly trained teachers, gaps between policy and practice, and a lack of resources needed to implement change. It has created some of a paradox that the wealthiest economy on the continent has also a schooling system that is among the poorest performing systems in the world, ranking 140 out of 144 countries.
Wow. African writers just wanted their voice to be heard. These writers were not looking to make a profit. They were writing because they wanted to unite South Africa against the oppression. Like I said before, some writers even put their land on the line so they could get their work published. During the apartheid, these anti-apartheid texts were seen as a threat and caused a lot of government censorship of texts and the creation of government-sponsored literature.
What would one of these texts that the government saw as a threat be about?
Great question. For example, Alex Laguma wrote A Walk in the Night, which is a novel that he wrote to try to help unite the South Africans and expose the horrors of the apartheid. These types of texts resulted in greater number of African white writers than South African writers. South African writers continue to express their opinion even though this may result in their exile.
So can you tell me more about this specific Native writer?
Actually, one of the greatest political activists during the apartheid was writer Alex Laguma. Laguma was born in Cape Town in 1925. He was a communist who helped create the National African Congress and many other political activist groups. He wrote countless articles and novels involving anti-apartheid and the reuniting of South Africa. Laguma said, "Flourishing under the warm sun of equality of all people, our culture, art, and literature will intermingle as liberated peoples will do, blossoming into a South African culture. We shall then read a South African literature, not what is described today as merely literature from South Africa or South African writing."
What ended up happening to Laguma?
So since he was so influential, he was a great threat to the government. Laguma was arrested for high treason in 1956, arrested again in 1960 along with 2,000 political leaders after the Sharpeville massacre, and eventually exiled. Even in his exile, he has fought for the rights of South Africans and served as a rep for the African National Congress in Cuba until his death. Laguma isn't the only revolutionary intellectual that was so influential.
Liz, what is your own opinion of this whole thing? You mentioned Kwabula, am I pronouncing that right? And La Guma impact, but personally, do you think they had a positive impact on the development of literature in South Africa?
I think the fact that these two revolutionary intellectuals were able to get their beliefs into the public is just what was needed to try to unite a struggling South Africa.
I love how you can actually see the progression of Africa's development through its literature from people like Laguma and Kabula.
That is very interesting hearing about your research because unknowingly I have come across something very similar relating to African music. You mentioned the importance of oral tradition, but from a literary perspective. But I found oral tradition also has a huge area of focus in the development of African music.
Oh, that's really interesting. How does that work relate to music?
Well, before the 1900s, their music was full of life, richness in the African culture. But due to the colonialization, the tradition of passing music from generation to generation was becoming lost. So in the 1950s, it became very important to musicologists to find and store archives of these songs that were once passed down.
So what made people's interest in music change in the 1950s?
Great question, Sean. In my research, I read many articles written by renowned musicologist Kofi Agawu. He wrote an article representing African music, which covered the progression of African music. Pre-1900s, when colonialization was at its height, there were many Western reports of African music. These reports included the barbarous, discordant, and vile sounds of the music played by the African people. These reports were not up to the scholarly standards we would have today when it comes to the objective reportings of different cultures, but it was a glimpse into the mindset of many Westerners during the colonialization of Africa. While this was not the uniform view all Westerners had, the reports created a monolithic view of Africa as a whole, not individualizing the many different cultures and languages spoken across the continent.
You mentioned earlier about how Westerners saw their music as underdeveloped in a sense. Is this where those three ways fit in? The ways African music began to develop away from their traditional sounds to a more Western sound?
Yes, exactly. The 1950s was a turning point for the African control over their own development. The African Music Society was formed in South Africa in 1947, whose goal was the advancement of research and the study of the field of ethnomusicology, for which purpose all interested persons, regardless of race, creed, color, or national origin, are encouraged to become members. This was the mark of when Africa began reclaiming their music.
How did the African Music Society impact South African music?
The mindset of seeing it as barbarous, discordant, and vital was completely changing, and it was beginning to be seen as being full of life, richness, and passion. This was a more accurate representation of the music, not judging it for its differences, but respecting it for its uniqueness. Schools like the University of South Africa began teaching musicology and its development in Africa. This was the beginning of a more formal approach to continuing the tradition of music. I do think it is very important to note, though, that the culture of Africa is heavily based on oral tradition, which, like Liz, you drew upon. So when Western academic practices relied more on written tradition, they failed to kind of understand or properly engage in the oral tradition of Africa. But by the help of scholars and archivists, the oral traditions of South Africa were recorded and are able to be studied by others. It was due to all of these events that South African music began drawing in worldwide attention because of their artists' ability to look back upon the heritage that could have been lost. It gained popularity within Western artists and who now have been working with African artists to capture the distinctive sounds of South African music styles.
Are there any examples of this?
And actually a popular music example came when Ladysmith Black Mambazo worked with Paul Simon on his Graceland album in 1986. We can play a quick clip of some of the styles that came from this album.
Hey Sean, play that funky music.
Silale maweni weba, silale maweni weba, silale maweni weba, silale maweni. Homeless
What we just listened to were clips from Paul Simon's Graceland album. Many of the voices you just heard came from the South African group Ladysmith Black Mambazo, amongst other South African artists.
Was that last clip a part of the album as well?
Actually, no. Thank you for pointing that out. The last clip you heard was a traditional Zulu song. The Zulus are the largest ethnic group in South Africa, making up about 10 million residents in the region. There were some of the people many Westerners would write reports on regarding the music and dancing traditions. They are also known for speaking in their native tongue and in their songs, which also include drums amongst other instruments that they play.
It's really cool to hear African music at its core, but also how they were able to collaborate with Westerners, which in turn made the music of South Africa instantly recognizable.
That is what I found so interesting in all of this, is because of the African music gaining popularity and these South African artists wanting to derive their art from the traditional South African popular music, that scholars believe it is the reason that helped save the traditional sounds of Africa, which sadly could have been lost forever if it was not for their interest in preservation of it all.
Wow, that is so cool! Out of curiosity, how did the apartheid impact African music, if at all?
So many of the artists in South Africa had to flee or go into exile due to the government's crackdowns around the time of the apartheid. Liz, you mentioned a similar situation regarding the Sharpeville massacre that occurred and how Laguma had to flee as well. A famous jazz musician from South Africa, Hugh Masekela, had to go into exile. Fleeing to America after that event, he learned from legends like Miles Davis and worked with artists like Stevie Wonder, Bob Marley, and Paul Simon on his Graceland album that we just heard a few moments ago. At the end of the apartheid, Masekela finally returned to South Africa, continuing his music career there until his death in 2018. Here is a quick snippet of Masekela's anti-apartheid song, protest song actually, Bringing Him Back Home, which is about the release of Nelson Mandela in 1986.
Hey Sean, play that funky music.
Bring back Nelson Mandela, bring him back home to Soweto.
I don't want to bore you guys with more details about it all, so I'll wrap up my discussion, but just to know that African music is continuing to incorporate their passion for oral traditions, similar to the Zulu traditional music, and it is still on the rise. Music is an incredibly important and impactful aspect of Africa's history, specifically South Africa's. It is such a positive movement that has come out of the people, allowing Africans to hold onto their heritage, create communities, voice their opinions, feelings, and so much more.
It's interesting how the different aspects and concentrations currently still impact the lives of people of South Africa today. I've done a lot of research in the data based on economic statistics that demonstrated the struggle of living in this society. Even following the success of shedding the grasp of apartheid, a proportion of people living in poverty since becoming a democratic state did not exactly make much of a difference. Since the early 2000s, there was a larger gap that developed between those of wealth and those who are impoverished, and developed into one of the most skewed distributions of income in the whole world.
Did this only affect the native South African people?
Well, actually, there even began to create a difference in class among the white Afrikaners too. Inequality was based specifically on the matter of race, of being white or black during the era of apartheid, but now there's a more defined separation of classes in both these races as well.
So what exactly was the typical wage of your everyday citizen?
It is actually quite eye-opening, surprising, as shown that approximately 1 in 10 South Africans were living with less than $1 per day. And what's even more remarkable is that 1 in 3 people were living on less than $2 per day.
Now, I thought their education had significantly benefited. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I think that's something worth mentioning too, because normally it's recognized that high levels of education are also correlated with high levels of health and well-being. With such disparities in education, it can be assumed that there are great levels of health issues that are happening, which should be correct. In devastating numbers, there are over 5.5 million people in South Africa that are diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. Parents are dying at an alarming rate too, leaving children orphaned. In 1999, there were about 3,700 orphans and another 500,000 children that died from the disease. Such numbers are continually growing today, as there is no cure for AIDS and only preventative measures for HIV, which are unavailable to those who are impoverished, which of course is the majority of their society. This epidemic has led to great civil unrest and high levels of corruption, including exploitation of young women and children in horrific fashions.
That is just awful to hear. Moving on, can you discuss the effects of the World Cup in South Africa?
Well, sports are fueled by competition, as you know, so it was likely that racial tensions were going to come up. The phrase Kanaka was used before the 2010 FIFA World Cup. It translates to "it is time" and refers to the readiness of South Africa to host a global event. Well, contrary to Shakira's song, this was not time for Africa. FIFA wanted to combat the reality of the turmoil and unrest by promoting Ubuntu, or African humanism. Hopefully, this would bring future investment and visitors, creating a catalyst for development to unite South Africans under a single flag. Instead of trying to support its own people, the government had spent 33 billion rand on the World Cup, showing no concern for the national welfare.
So Sean, can you discuss the trip that you just went on to South Africa for us?
Definitely. I was granted a Smith Fellowship through Providence College, and this summer I was going to South Africa to work in the St. Martin de Porres Development Project, a community-based and Dominican organization offering psychosocial support to orphaned and vulnerable children in light of the AIDS and HIV crisis. The need still exists to help the people of South Africa, and although I can still help out in some way, this is a nation that is still progressing and needs your support.
That is so interesting. So we can see through the history of South Africa, they have had their trials and tribulations and they still face many problems to this day. However, we do need to realize that this is a country that is fairly new to being released from the chains of apartheid. It is impressive that they have come this far from their colonial struggles and not turning to dictatorships like many newly freed countries do. And that is something that we can all appreciate.
Well, it seems like we have run out of time for today, so let's give a big hand to Grace and Liz for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Me too. I loved hearing how my research has paralleled with South Africa's history, including the literature and its economical state.
I agree. It's been wonderful having the chance to dive into this beautiful and rich culture, but that's all the time we have today. Until next time, we'll see you later. Stay classy, Done with Sivers.
A great thanks to our sponsor, Ryan Carries' Jelly Munchkins. Shout out to Ryan.
Friartown runs on Duncan. Mention Carius at the Providence College location and receive a free munchkin. That is jelly, of course.
Thank you for your continuous support, and thanks to our faithful listeners. Love you, Ma. And for those who want to support my role model, Ted Andrews, of whom my apprenticeship is under, please buy his new book, Native Apostles. You can find this incredible novel at your local Amazon and Barnes & Noble bookstore.
Thank you for being a friend. Travel down a road and back again. Your heart is true, you're a pal and a confidant.